Welcome back. You're watching Startup on Bloomberg Television. Now, Goldman Sachs says the SEC's fraud case against it will stand or fall on the actions of just one executive director. Fabrice Tour is the man at the centre of the matter, accused of misleading investors who bought into a subprime mortgage-based portfolio 3 years ago. The banks placed him on indefinite paid leave, perhaps the first sign Goldman is distancing itself from him. The investment bank's co-general counsel Greg Powell says it's all going to be a factual dispute about what he remembers and the other folks remember on the other side. The investment bank also says that Tor is now being deregistered by the FSA in London, where he's been working. Well, the bank completely denies misleading investors. Let's try and understand where this Goldman case is heading. I'm joined from Zurich by David Costa, a professor at the Robert Kennedy College. David, good morning. Thanks for joining us.
Good morning, Mark.
Are we seeing, David, are we seeing Goldman Sachs just steadily, subtly distancing itself from the man at the centre of this case now, David Tor?
Yes, we are seeing that, and I think it's certainly a very good strategy. That said, let's not forget that this person is relatively young, so he's not really convincing the argument to say no one else knew about this trade, but it's certainly a very good strategy from the management to take the distance, and whomever is responsible to say it's not a global problem of the bank. If there is any wrongdoing, might have been just by few people or limited number of individuals. So trying to contain the damages is certainly a very good strategy.
But of course, it's unlikely that the damage was made by just one person. I suppose the big question is, David, how many and how high did it go?
Yeah, that's certainly the very big question. It's very difficult to say it was just one person. That said, the arguments of Goldman so far, I think, makes a lot of sense. The first is that on the other side, certainly the bank knew that there was a short side of the deal, which is very common, and there were all these, Goldman repeated that continuously, professional investment which knew the type of risk. And in terms of risk management, I think that the banks which lost money on the deal should have been in the position to consider what if scenario, what if this trade goes against us? So blaming only Goldman from that, I don't think it makes a lot of sense. All depends on how much influence Paulson had in creating those instruments.
David, what's the worst case scenario here? We know it's being pursued by the SEC. It's now being pursued by the FSA here in the UK as well. What's the worst case scenario for Goldman Sachs out of this?
Well, in the very short term, the worst-case scenario is that we see this problem ballooning, and we see FSA and potentially also the German regulator taking action, and even AIG perhaps taking action against Goldman. So the moment is crucial in the next weeks to see if the Goldman is capable to contain the problem, and it's going to be just this SEC story, or there are going to be others adding it. We know from Bloomberg News that the vote was not unanimous, and so that gives a bit of confidence to investors, as we have seen yesterday. So the next week are crucial, and then the worst case scenario is obviously a conviction.
Reputational damage is potentially the biggest of all. Will we see clients of Goldman Sachs switch to other firms?
At the moment, I think it's very early. It's not going to happen unless we see some more details coming into light. What there is now on the table is pretty much, as Goldman defined it, as a number of factual circumstances. There is nothing concrete. If we see something bigger, or if we see a regulator in the UK or Germany taking action, the damage will be much higher. But at the moment, I think that if there isn't any big negative development in the next weeks, Goldman could possibly try to limit this and eventually even settle that down the road with the SEC.
On the larger scale, David, of course, this gives ammunition to politicians and regulators, doesn't it? It adds impetus to financial reform efforts, which in the long term could erode the earnings potential at banks like Goldman Sachs.
Yes, obviously politicians like this type of story because they take a lot of attention on the limelight. And on the long term, this is very dangerous. I mean, if we had, like some people forecasted in the last days, Goldman as being a catalyst of, a big correction, that could certainly influence not only Goldman. So essentially, I think all has to be handled with care. But the main matter is if the Goldman, as they contain, have been acting as a mere intermediary, and so being on the middle of a deal, it would be very hard for the SEC to prove any wrongdoing here.
As it is, David, very quickly, I mean, yesterday's quarterly figures I mean, the company's going from strength to strength, isn't it?
Absolutely. The management is doing the right things and retaining the best talent, so I think it's going to do very well if they try to solve this problem.
David, thanks for joining us today. David Costa there, live from Zurich. Now, failed bank Lehman Brothers is back in the spotlight. Chief Executive Dick Full told the Congressional Committee he never assumed the U.S. government